koto katoa, ko Black Mountain tōku maunga.
Could you speak a little bit louder?
Is there a
microphone?
We don't know.
Shall we turn off the air
I'm not sure we can, actually.
I think it's centralized. I will try speaking louder. Can you hear me at the back there? Can't hear me. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Yes.
Much
nice.
better.
Thank you.
Ko Black Mountain tōku maunga. Ko Malongo tōku awa. Ko Ngāti Pākehā tōku iwi. Ke Ward tōku kapu. Ko Māori Hill tōku marae. Ko Sue Rawa, ko Graham Oku Mātua. Ko Lucina tōku tuapana. Ko Vanessa Ward tōku ingoa. No o te pōti Aotearoa aho. No reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's customary in New Zealand to use the mihi to identify oneself and put oneself in the context of place and whakapapa or genealogy. You may know that Māori, the indigenous New Zealand, were, as they self-identify, a warring tribal people. So it was very important when one person encountered another to identify themselves in terms of where they come from, both in terms of the topography, the maunga, the awa, but also in terms of their iwi, their tribe, their hapu, their particular family village. So Doug mentioned in his introduction what I'm doing here. I'm working on a project about the role that publishers played in supporting the reinvigoration of intellectual life in early post-war Japan. Also about the role of SCAP, GHQ, in shaping post-war intellectual culture. Can you still hear me at the back? I'm already aware that I'm going to struggle to maintain this volume, so please just wave, if when my voice, the volume decreases, and I'll do my best to rank it up. I hope that the article that comes out of this research will not only contribute to the sparse English language literature on publishing in early post-war Japan, but also shed light on the role of SCAP, GHQ in shaping post-war intellectual culture. I've wanted to visit the Prang collection since I learned about occupation era censorship when I did my doctoral studies some considerable time ago. More than half, or for some of you, more than half a lifetime ago. I would like, so it was an honour to receive the research award. I want to thank Kana Jenkins, Amy, will I say it in the Swedish form, Vesaström, and Yukako Tatsumi for their assistance and generous hospitality in the 3 weeks that I've been here. And to thank the Miller Centre for sponsoring the award. So, which I've listed up for you here. So I've already mentioned one, SCAP, CHQ. SCAP is the acronym for the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, and it refers to both the person of General Douglas MacArthur as well as his mammoth administration. And some Japanese names. As I've just mentioned, I'll be referring to some of these without including the English gloss, so I thought I should just spend a very quick moment now going through some of them. So the first, Shisou no Kagaku, is the name of one of the journals that I'm focusing on in this project. Common Man's Philosophy is the English translation of one of its first projects, and I'll talk about that as well. The second journal, which serves as a comparison, is the journal Sekai. The intellectual group that was associated with it that I'm looking at is the Peace Problems Discussion Group, which actually you don't have there because I took it off. Where's the line? I beg your pardon, it's down there. So I've got already out of order here. The intellectual group, which is associated with the journal Shisou no Kagaku, is called the Institute for the Science of Thought, using the English translation of the journal title Shisono Kagaku, Science of Thought. The publishing company that was set up for the purpose of publishing Science of Thought by the Institute is the Science of Thought, is what it was called, basically. So it's a publishing company. The names which follow on are the names of the 7 co-founders of the journal Shisono Kagaku. And clearly the end marks have gone. So what I'd say to my students is that insist on that being corrected before it went up on blackboard. Before introducing the research project and the 2 intellectual journals and groups which are its focus in a bit more detail, I'd like to briefly outline an important context: the publishing situation in post-defeat Japan. In immediate post-defeat Japan, in the world of publishing, as in many other areas of society, the removal of wartime restrictions and the introduction of democratic reforms led to a flurry of activity. Publishing firms that had ceased publishing during wartime reorganised themselves, and new companies mushroomed. In August 1945, there were about 300 publishing companies. Within 4 months, this number had almost doubled. By the end of the following year, so by the end of 1946, the number had increased to 2,500. A strong optimism permeated the industry. Established publishing houses such as Hei Bonsha and Iwanami Shoten, many of which had suspended activity at some point during the war, immediately set about resuming business. Many were faced with the difficulties of the times: shortages of paper, the destruction of printing facilities, the lack of a readily available ink, so on. Other companies re-emerged with slightly different names. The epithet new was commonplace. Newly formed companies were of all types, but particularly notable were companies committed to promoting social and political change through the publication of leftist literature. Socialist and communist writings had been vigorously suppressed since the early 1930s in Japan, and there was now a strong public demand for them. Public demand for reading material, anything other than staple wartime wholesomeness or imperialist ideology, mobilised the industry. Soon, everything from, quote, sleazy pulp magazines to incisive critical magazines and political writings, end quote, was available. In an environment where anything in print sold, prescient publishing projects could bring a quick fortune. Another sort of entrepreneurial drive, which was predicated on the dearth of entertaining reading during wartime, resulted in much more popular reading material described by some industry representatives as worthless. Much of this was inexpensively produced using very poor quality paper, thus reinforcing its cheap image. A flood of erotic writing also stirred much debate, prompting calls for publishers to exercise better judgment. Public discourse and intellectual activity were encouraged and supported by a steady flow of new periodicals. Science of Thought, Shisono Kagaku, and I'll be using both the Japanese and the English just to keep you on your toes, was one of them. There were also many other equally energetic but more short-lived left-wing publications and the titles of these periodicals reflected the aspirations of publishers and intellectuals in the new era. Publishers were quick to welcome SCAP's guarantee of freedom of expression with a minimum of restriction, but soon discovered that the attached conditions left much scope for SCAP's interference. I'll just finish this point and then maybe we can straight. So, conditions left much scope for SCAP interference. Censorship essential to the peace preservation regime that was a central part of the pre-war and wartime system of Japanese thought control became an important tool for the maintenance of public tranquility during the early phase of SCAP reforms. After the end of the occupation in September 1951, censorship continued, not as a dictate of the state, but in the customs and practices of authors and publishers. The taboo on the discussion of the emperor or the emperor system, for example, in Europe, a leading publisher's wariness of this sensitive topic shaped the history of science thought. It led to the intellectual group associated with the journal to establish its own publisher. So maybe this is the opportunity to pause. So I just briefly outlined the context for publishing in immediate post-war Japan and referred to a very important part of the context, which was the ongoing censorship. But this was not to be generally known. The mere fact that the Allied occupation force had censorship was censored. Okay, so ostensibly there was no censorship during the occupation period. I'm sorry, Amy, you wouldn't be here if it was for that. Okay. So the research project that I've been working on in the Pranger collection is focused on two intellectual journals launched in the first half of 1946, Shiso no Kagaku and Sekai, and the groups associated with them, the Institute for the Science of Thought and the Peace Problems Discussion Group. In the case of the former intellectual group, there's a very, very clear association, albeit it was established several years after the journal. In the case of the Peace Problems Discussion Group, this is, I don't want to say, it's not a random choice on my part. It is very clearly associated with the journal, Sekai, and we may have time for me to explain that association afterwards. But it was only active for a couple of years, late 1940s and early 1950s. So very different intellectual groups, very different journals. Both journals survived tumultuous immediate post-war years. Interestingly, the Peace Problems Discussion Group membership included the majority of the 7 co-founders of Shiso no Kagaku. This similarity highlights the different publishing histories of the journal, which in turn offers a crucial insight into the contribution of publishers to setting the agenda of post-war intellectual life. It also highlights the journal's distinct foci and their quite different approaches to the public, the category of the public. I've just mentioned different publishing histories. Let me give you a little bit more of a sense of this situation. Sekai represented the dying wish of the founder of Iwanami Publishing House. It was his wish, he died in late 46, to reinvigorate informed discussion after the war, to a forum through which intellectuals could communicate more effectively with the public, a popular outlet for engaged intellectual discourse. Iwanami Shigeru criticized himself and all of Japan's intellectuals for having published for one another, ignoring the general public. He felt that he personally and intellectuals more generally have abdicated their responsibility to bring the habits of critical thinking to the Japanese population at large, and thereby contributed to the military's strong popular support before and during the war. I'm quoting from a fine scholar at Northwestern University, Laura Hine there. Sekai soon became the leading forum for debate on contemporary political problems, including the so-called peace problem. This comprised the nature of the peace treaty that Japan would sign. The journal led the challenge to official attacks on Japan's peace constitutions in the 1960s and continued to tackle a wide range of topical issues to this day. Over the long post-war, Sekai was a gadfly to the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, which was neither particularly liberal nor democratic. The journal continues to attract the ire of the right wing, which charges it with being in the grip of leftist intellectuals. And that is the best populist card you can play. Its special issues have become collector's items, and its regular columns have dedicated readers. For its part, Shisono Kagaku was the realization of a drive to change fundamentally the nature of academic research on philosophy. I'll just pause here, very brief digression. The thought in the title of the journal is shiso in Japanese, which is very hard to accurately translate. So the co-founders used the more formal term tetsugaku for philosophy, for academic philosophy. But as we'll see, they were actually just as much interested in shiso, in thought, more generally. So Shiso no Kagaku later became a forum for intellectuals and ordinary people to connect through grassroots research projects. Indeed, an early and enduring priority was to reshape intellectuals' relationship with ordinary people and engage the latter in systematic philosophical inquiry. The intellectuals behind both journals were committed to the democratic reconstruction of Japan. Both envisaged something new, broadly speaking, a new type of intellectual discourse. And both journals became symbols of the opportunities afforded by defeat. Sekai was established on the basis of three ideals. First, achieving peace and social justice. Second, freedom and equality. Third, harmony and solidarity with the peoples of East Asia. So that third ideal might give you some sense of how the intellectuals associated with the journal reflected on the recent past. According to a former editor-in-chief, these ideals incorporated modern Western principles and represented the antitheses of Japan's pre-war ideology. They also basically tied in with official democratic reforms and the agenda of SCAP GHQ. Sekai tackled... Can you still hear me at the back? Is that okay? And am I going too fast? Sekai, thank you. It's nice to be refreshing to have a response. Maybe American audiences are different. Sekai, as I indicated a moment ago, tackled fundamental topical issues such as the nature, not only the so-called peace problem, but larger issues, the nature of democracy, the sort of democracy that post-war Japan was to become. It asked basic questions such as, where should Japan be heading? What kind of country do we want Japan to be? Questions central to which were issues of Japan's identity and its place in the post-war world. Shisono Karaku was also concerned with these questions, but as we'll see, approached them in very different ways. The similarities between the two journals basically end there. Sekai was strikingly elitist. The central assumption of its publisher and its editors was that although Japanese intellectuals had created great culture and theoretical literature, their contribution went unappreciated because they had failed to train the masses in complex political, cultural and economic thought. That is, they had failed in their duty as teachers and guides. The establishment of Sekai might be seen as part of an attempt to absolve intellectuals' contrition at not having been done enough to prevent the war. The motivation of the intellectuals behind Shisono Karaku was neither so introspective nor condescending. They didn't see ordinary people as needing to be guided. Rather, they sought to uncover the innate wisdom of the ordinary man and woman. I want to explore this last idea in a little bit of detail because it was central to one of the group's earliest projects, the philosophy of the common man, common man's philosophy. A warning for any undergraduates among you, I'm going to be referring to lots of isms, which are just basically fancy ways of saying ideas and ideologies and discourses. Okay. Inspired by the American pragmatism that they sought to introduce, the group behind Shisono Karaku claimed that the everyday lives and quotidian thoughts and experiences of ordinary Japanese were valid and indeed valuable subjects of research. To understand why ordinary Japanese didn't mount effective resistance to militarism and to empower them to participate in social change in the post-war era, researchers needed to understand the structure and patterns of their thought. There were also important resonances between pragmatism's emphasis on thought and action in daily life, empirical analysis, and the ethos and research methods of the Common Man Philosophy project. Common Man's Philosophy began as a research project on popular forms of entertainment in late 1946. A concerted focus emerged a couple of years later in journal issues that were subtitled Common Man's Philosophy. These issues contained analysis of a whole lot of things. So, for example, analysis of the expressions of ordinary people's thought, values and attitudes in forms of mass communication. They also presented collaborative research on the popular novel, analyses of popular forms of mass entertainment, Japanese oral performance traditions. The things people see and hear was the rubric used. Film research methodology, the thinking and language of soldiers, collaborative research on Japanese popular songs, and so on and so forth. I might stop there. Interviews with individuals of different occupations reflected the centrality of the interview in the Institute's research methodology. Common Man's Philosophy was a two-pronged project. It brought together one of the co-founders, Tsurumi Shunsuke's desire to rehabilitate philosophy into something useful along the lines of American pragmatism. And in addition, the effort to stimulate a problem-solving consciousness and critical thinking capacity at the grassroots by encouraging ordinary people to think through the problems that they encountered in their everyday lives. And as you can imagine, in the immediate post-war period, they were manifold. Such a consciousness was vital to engagement in broader political spheres, and it was thought would ultimately result in a polity less susceptible to the distortionary effects of monopoly capitalism and reactionary state authority. While the term democracy appeared infrequently in the co-founders' contributions to the journal, the concept was an important, indeed central element in the Anglo-American intellectual traditions that the co-founders introduced through the pages of Shisou no Karaku. If I'm not going too fast, I might press on. I could skip.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry?
Yes, ma'am.
Skip?
Oh, no, I meant.
Press on.
Yeah.
Okay. I did give you the option. The term hitobido in the name of the project was also important. Japanese is a language in which there are many possible vocabulary choices for any English language term. So hitobido connotes multiple individuals, and it clearly contrasted with the idea of the masses, Jinmin Taishu, that underpinned the orthodox Marxist conceptualization of ordinary people as the proletariat, and its emphasis on proletarian class interests. Admittedly, though, the group's attention to individuals' thoughts, values, everyday attitudes and experiences connected it to Marxist discourse by implication. As individuals and as a group, the co-founders of Shisou no Karaku were part of a larger conversation that entailed the reconceptualization of important relationships between the individual and the state, the individual and society, state and society. A crucial point of difference between Shisou no Karaku and established philosophy journals was its broad conceptualization of thought that opened up discussions to new audiences, and its inclusivity. Contributions to the journal were welcomed from intellectuals and non-intellectuals, institute members and non-members alike, with the sole requirements that articles be written in an accessible style and that their findings be verifiable by experience or logic. In its early years, the Institute for the Science of Thought embraced Anglo-American thought, specifically the doctrine of pragmatism with its strong traditions of empiricism and positivism, in an attempt to counter the doctrinarism, I told you there'd be lots of isms, that pervaded much of academia and the intellectual world, specifically in the form of Marxism and phenomenology. As such, it offered an alternative approach to the study of thought and issues of contemporary importance at a time when the word science was closely associated with leftist ideology. And we don't have time to go into the various options for titles that the co-founders scrutinised. Opportunity for something else, another time. Shisou no Karaku deliberately sought to distinguish, and the distinguished themselves from organisations such as the Association of Democratic Scientists, which was perceived as a factional tool of the Japanese Communist Party. In contrast to this association, Science of Thought and the Institute for the Science of Thought embraced disciplinary impartiality and methodological pluralism. It aligned itself with no particular discipline or specialisation. The journal's co-founders were suspicious of systems of thought per se, and the Institute distinguished itself from other groups through its receptive attitude towards diversity of outlook and ideology. The diverse scholarly expertise of the co-founders supported this intellectual stance. Maruyama Masao and Takeda Kyoko were intellectual historians. Tsuru Shigeto was an economist. Tsurumi Kazuko was a sociologist. Tsurumi Shunsuke and Watanabe Satoru were philosophers, and Taketani Mitsuo was a physicist. The co-founders also spanned a wide age range. The oldest, in 1946, was 36 years of age. The youngest was 24 years old. Their experiences, including of the recent past wartime, were quite diverse as well. The publishing histories of the journals are very different. Sekai has only had one publisher. It continues to be published to this day. Shisou no Kagaku had four in its first 2 decades, and it ceased publication in 1996 on its 50th anniversary. And that was a decision that the publishing company and the Institute made together on their own terms, that is. The publishing history of Sekai is better known than that of Shisou no Kagaku. Although it must be said that a project to record Shisou no Kagaku's history leading up to its 50th anniversary has resulted in several substantial and very useful volumes, including indices and various chronologies and collections of reminiscences by key figures. It remains the case, though, that Sekai has received far more attention in the literature on post-war Japan than has Shisou no Kagaku. Iwanami Shoten was an established publisher in 1946 with a reputation for sponsoring leading Japanese and international thinkers. It was famous for its multi-volume works on Japanese history and collected works of individual thinkers. Its paperback imprints, Iwanami Bunko and Iwanami Shiso, that respectively published foreign and Japanese classics and the writings of leading Japanese thinkers on critical topical issues, were hugely popular. They were deliberately inexpensively priced to reach a wide audience. By contrast, Shisou no Kagaku had a precarious existence. It was founded by a small group of intellectuals committed to democratizing the Japanese academy by introducing Anglo-American schools of thought. They wouldn't have expressed it in that way, they wouldn't have seen them as schools of thought, but rather important sets of ideas and intellectual tradition. They also wanted to encourage researchers to attend to the thinking, the value, the attitudes of the ordinary person. Its founders included intellectuals who were to become almost household names and leading academics such as Maruyama Masao and Tsuru Shigeto, as well as much lesser known social scientists. My focus has been on the younger generation, comprising the Tsurumi siblings, Kazuko and Shunsuke, and Takeda Kyoko. While all of the co-founders were open to American sorry, the majority of the co-founders had been educated in American universities. 4 of 7, so a bare majority. While all were open to American thought and pro-American according to wartime standards, they essentially agreed with the direction of SCAP reforms, although several had declined invitations to work for the occupation administration. Their analysis of American intellectual traditions, though, was by no means uncritical. Tsuru, the Tsurumis and Takeda would have been in high demand, sought after by SCAP for their language skills and potential to be spokesmen for American cultural policy. To a certain extent, they were bicultural, and their apparently English language skills were very good. But Shisono Kakaku's connections with prominent pre-war internationalists, such as Tsurumi Yusuke, would also have promoted interest within SCAP. Yusuke, father of Kazuko and Shunsuke, financed the journal in its first 4 years. Shisono Kakaku's first publisher was a creation of its co-founders, the Tsurumis in particular. The journal wouldn't be associated with an established publisher until its 9th year. And even then, that association endured for less than a year. Its popularity is also evident in the lengthy hiatus in the second half of the 1950s. That Shisono Kakaku didn't go the way of many periodicals established in the heady environment of publishing in the immediate post-defeat period. The majority of the journals established were very short-lived. Was undoubtedly due to its distinct approach to intellectual discourse and, one must say, the fortunate circumstances of its first publisher. Tsurumi Yusuke had been the director of an entity called Taiyo Kyokai, which was basically a think tank with privileged access to paper and printing facilities. And Tsurumi Kazuko made connections in its American research room. She persuaded, which was just one branch of that the organisation, where, importantly, pro-American or open intellectuals, or I should maybe say non-militarist intellectuals, that's probably a better way of saying, used to congregate. So she worked in that research wing, and she made important connections which would come into play to keep the journal going. Lengthy digression there. To explain what I mean by the fortunate circumstances of its publishers. So while other publishers fought tooth and nail for paper rations and coped with really poor quality paper, so on and so forth, Senkusha had ready access, at least for a while. The only other magazine established in 1946 that has survived as long is Sekai. Science of Thought's longevity is remarkable in view of the absence of a single publisher to sustain it, in contrast to Sekai, or the backing of an established academic institution. Allied occupation of Japan, Sekai depended on SCAP, more specifically its information division, for information for its, or for copy indeed, for its regular column on world events. The Peace Problems Discussion Group also had its origin with SCAP in a so-called UNESCO statement that a SCAP officer handed to Sekai editor Yoshino Genzaburo. In the statement sponsored by the UN agency, 8 intellectuals from Eastern and Western Europe expressed their sense of urgency in the face of rising international tensions and ideological conflict between East and West. And of course, they meant Eastern Europe, Western Europe, not the Far East per se. For Yoshino, the statement exemplified the contribution that intellectuals could make to the potential formation of a new order based on the values of pacifism and humanism. As the chill of the Cold War began to be felt in Asia, Yoshino conceived of a similar project for Japan. He brought together high-profile public figures, liberal men of culture, and scholars both established and emerging from different fields and generations to form a group to consider and comment on the UNESCO statement. His project fit well with the 3 ideals on which Sekai was founded. In their first meeting in December 48, the men and 2 women, guess who they were? Takeda Kyoko, Tsurumi Kazuko, they considered 4 specific issues. First, how to promote accommodation between the Cold War camps. Second, in this regard, what intellectual attitude and political policy should be adopted by Japan. Third, how traditional thought patterns should be revised to realise this goal. Fourth, what the alternatives were to polarising positions that advocated overthrow American imperialism or support American democracy, destroy communism. So was there not an alternative to these diverse positions, polarising positions? That meeting issued a preliminary statement which was published in the March 1949 issue of Sekai, a special issue on world peace and the peace problem. The second statement that appeared in March 1950 was a more definitive one. And you can just imagine how much work went into formulating 4 succinct statements. So there were up to 48 intellectuals who participated in these meetings. Remember, they came from a range of ideological positions. They were of different generations and came with their different experiences and expectations. But with the help of one particularly well-organised person, they came up with these 4 statements. And you can read them for yourself. Although very different in their approach, in terms of their approach to political activism, the Peace Problems Discussion Group and the Institute for the Science of Thought had arguably similar attitudes towards ideology and political affiliation. Their members held various ideological positions from conservative to progressive, so on that spectrum. Importantly though, in the case of the Peace Problems Discussion Group, none were active members of political parties or otherwise closely associated with political movements. For its part, the Institute for the Science of Thought was wary of the ideological constraints of affiliation to left-wing political groups and the dominance of Marxism over intellectual life. In other words, both groups were concerned that their members' independence and capacity for rational critical thought should not be compromised by political affiliation. The Institute for the Science of Thought championed, as we've seen, ideological pluralism and diversity of both research topics and methodologies. It was principally a research collective. The Peace Problems Discussion Group was a forum for discussion and research, not a political association. Though, I might mention, with a shift in occupation policies in the late 1940s, the peace treaty issue was increasingly politicised. Any position came to be seen as reflecting a political stance. So the Peace Problems Discussion Group's apolitical stance came into question when its second statement attracted the attention of SCAP, and it came under scrutiny by the Attorney General's Office's Special Investigation Bureau, which was tasked with examining the group as a possible political organisation. And its statements were also subject to the scrutiny of SCAP censors. You're holding out so well. In exploring the Prang collection, I've been particularly keen to see whether or not there's evidence that SCAP may have been interested in Shisoma Karaku and its co-founders, in addition to copy with censors' marks. The journal's focus on leading American thinkers, its emphasis on liberating Japanese thought from the constraints of pre-war scholarship, and the backgrounds and networks of its co-founders suggests that SCAP officers would have been interested in it. In the research plan in my application for the 20th Century Japan Research Award, I wrote, quoting myself, there is virtually no information on interaction between members of the Occupation Administration and the co-founders of Shisoma Karaku. I still haven't found any. Sometimes research, the absence of evidence, points to something in and of itself, but evidence is much better because it frees one up from speculation. So I would have liked to find some. And I may do. As I've outlined, Sekai's link with SCAP is clearer. I've also had my eye out for references to the Christian woman intellectual and scholar Cho Takeda Kyoko. So Takeda Kyoko married a Marxist intellectual, a student who courted her. He was 7 years her junior, and he pestered her to write articles for their student magazine, and apparently won her over. So she became Cho Takeda Kyoko. A biography that locates her story in the context of Japan's trajectory in the 20th century is a long-term research project. Takeda Kyoko was co-founder of Shisoma Karaku and one of the two women who were involved in the Peace Problems Discussion Group. She was also closely associated with the foundation of the International Christian University in Tokyo, which received strong support from the highest levels of SCAP GH. The focus on Shisoma Karaku's initial projects, the introduction of Anglo-American thought and common man's philosophy, also reveals the influence of the other female co-founder, Tsurumi Kazuko, a very impressive lady indeed. She was a key figure in the engagement of intellectuals in the life composition movement, a movement that challenged the idea that the written word was the preserve of professional writers, novelists, journalists, academics, and sought to awaken the individual subjectivity of the amateur writer. So let's become aware of the problems that we face in everyday life by meeting with one another and writing about them. I hope that an exploration of Shisola Kagako will contribute in a small way to rectifying the absence of women's voices in literature on post-war Japanese intellectual life. And there's one last slide. No, there's not. But it would say, if there was, thank you for your attention and bearing with me.